German fleet. North Sea, 1943. Night, low clouds, poor visibility. At first, everything seemed to be unfolding exactly as planned. The North Sea was restless, dark water slamming into hulls at awkward angles, wind dragging sheets of mist across the surface. Visibility was poor, but not unusual. This was the kind of night German crews had trained for again and again. The instruments were steady, courses held. The fleet moved with quiet confidence, not optimism, but habit. This was doctrine at work. Each ship stayed in its assigned position. Spacing was exact, speed carefully regulated, signals passed cleanly through the formation, nothing rushed, nothing improvised. Every movement followed procedures officers knew by heart. From the bridges, it all felt under control. Lookouts peered into the darkness, but uncertainty didn't breed panic. Doctrine existed for nights like this. When sight failed, procedure took over. The fleet trusted that predictability meant safety, that if every ship behaved as expected, command could handle whatever followed. That belief shaped everything. The guns were manned, but not tense. Fire control crews tracked bearings with calm precision. Course corrections were small and deliberate. The fleet neither surged forward nor scattered defensively. It advanced as planned, confident that any encounter would unfold on familiar terms. What no one on the German bridges fully grasped was how exposed that discipline had become. Doctrine creates patterns. Courses repeat, speeds settle, formations announce intent long before contact is made. What feels like control from within can look like certainty from the outside, certainty that can be used. Somewhere beyond the mist, the enemy wasn't guessing. They were waiting. German doctrine assumed action would come after contact. Once the enemy revealed itself, cohesion would allow a fast, unified response. Surprise was expected, but only briefly. Even an ambush was thought to leave seconds to adapt. Those seconds were already gone. The fleet's predictability had erased them. Positions had been anticipated, likely maneuvers charted in advance. The enemy didn't need to improvise, they only needed to confirm what doctrine said would happen next. Aboard the German ships, nothing yet hinted at danger. No flares. No distant gunfire. No alarms breaking routine. The sea still appeared empty. Then it was. The first salvos didn't announce discovery, they confirmed expectation. Shells struck where the ships were supposed to be, not where they might have surprised. Impacts landed so close together that crews struggled to tell which ship had been hit first. Fire blossomed, steel twisted, shock tore through hulls faster than reports could be shouted. For the first time that night, the plan no longer mattered. Command reacted at once, signals sent, course changes ordered, but every response addressed a situation the enemy had already anticipated. Maneuvers meant to reduce danger exposed fresh angles to fire. Doctrine-guided turns placed ships exactly where the enemy expected them. That was when the realization began to spread. Nothing had failed. Nothing had broken. But everything had been predicted. The German fleet hadn't stumbled into disaster. It had followed the plan perfectly. And that perfection made the outcome unavoidable. The plan had been designed for nights exactly like this. In 1943, German naval doctrine valued order above everything else. In the North Sea, crowded, shallow, and unpredictable, staying together meant survival. A tight formation allowed ships to share information, concentrate firepower, and react as one when contact came. Separation invited confusion. Improvisation risked collision. So the plan leaned into certainty. Courses were chosen to limit exposure. Speeds were carefully set to keep spacing exact. Maneuvers were arranged so every ship knew what the others would do next. Even under fire, doctrine assumed that predictability was the key to maintaining control. From inside the fleet, that felt comforting. Officers didn't have to wonder how nearby ships would react. They already knew. Lookouts could focus on the darkness ahead, confident that movement within the formation would remain steady. Command issued orders knowing they would be carried out the same way every time. This wasn't stubbornness. It was efficiency. The plan assumed that uncertainty came from the enemy, not from the fleet itself. If German ships behaved consistently, then any deviation, any contact, would stand out clearly against a stable background. Doctrine was meant to quiet the noise so threats could be recognized quickly. The problem was easy to miss. Predictability only works when it isn't shared. By 1943, opposing forces had studied German naval behavior in detail. The patterns were familiar, the responses well understood. What felt neutral and disciplined from within the fleet had become valuable information to the enemy. Each perfectly executed maneuver reduced uncertainty, not for the Germans, but for those watching them. The plan never accounted for that imbalance. It assumed both sides were still discovering each other in real time. It assumed surprise required sudden revelation. In reality, the enemy had already played the scenario forward, step by step, based on how German ships were expected to move. That made anticipation simple. If contact occurred here, the fleet would turn there. If fire came from that direction, doctrine dictated this response. If visibility worsened, spacing would tighten in a precise, predictable way. These weren't guesses. They were expectations built on repetition. From the German bridges, none of this was apparent. Crews measured success by how smoothly everything ran. Signals were clear, formations held, engines answered instantly. There was no friction, no warning sign, nothing to suggest danger. The absence of disruption reinforced the belief that the plan was working. That confidence delayed doubt. When the first shells struck, command assumed the doctrine still applied. Adjustments were made within the plan, not outside it. The instinct wasn't to break predictability, but to execute the next step even more cleanly. It was a reasonable response. It was also exactly what the enemy had planned for. The doctrine had created a closed loop. Predictable movement invited anticipated response, which met pre-aimed fire, which forced another predictable maneuver. Every correct action narrowed the fleet's options instead of expanding them. What made this especially dangerous was how normal it all felt. The plan didn't unravel slowly. It didn't show warning signs. It functioned perfectly, right up until it carried the fleet to the exact place where disaster was already waiting. By the time German command began to realize that predictability itself was the threat, the next maneuver was already in motion. And the enemy already knew where it would end. The enemy didn't wait to see what the German fleet would do. They already knew. Doctrine had turned behavior into prediction. Speed ranges, turn angles, how formations tightened in poor visibility, every step followed a logic that had been observed before. Once contact became likely, anticipation replaced reaction. Guns were aimed where ships were expected to be, not where they had been seen. That changed everything about the opening moments. When radar contact settled, the enemy didn't test or probe. They acted. Fire control solutions were already in place, built around expected maneuvers. The first salvos weren't guesses, they were confirmations. For the German fleet, it didn't feel that way at first. Shells landing close could still be dismissed as bad luck. In the confusion of first contact, crews often assume coincidence before they recognize pattern, but as follow-up salvos arrived, tight, corrected, overlapping, that explanation became harder to hold on to. The fire hadn't found them. It had been waiting. Every doctrinal response moved ships into danger that had already been calculated. Turns meant to reduce exposure, lined hulls up with known firing arcs. Speed changes meant to preserve cohesion, kept ships at ideal range. Tightening the formation to maintain control only concentrated the damage. Command reacted immediately. Orders came fast, confident, and by the book. This wasn't hesitation, it was training taking over. The problem was that the enemy had already built those same steps into their own plan. Reaction now lagged anticipation by seconds. And seconds mattered. By the time a maneuver was completed, the next salvo was already inbound. When German ships tried to correct again, enemy aim shifted with them. The fleet wasn't being chased. It was being met. This was the moment predictability turned deadly. Improvisation might have broken the cycle. An unexpected move could have forced recalculation, but improvisation was exactly what doctrine warned against in poor visibility. Breaking formation risked collision, friendly fire, and complete loss of control. So the fleet stayed disciplined. And that discipline kept it readable. As smoke and fog thickened, the imbalance grew. Visual contact vanished for both sides, but only one side relied on it. Radar-guided fire kept landing where doctrine said the ships would be next. German crews began to sense something was wrong. Not suddenly, not clearly, just a creeping awareness that every correct move made things worse. Damage reports clustered around familiar points in the formation. The ships executing textbook maneuvers were the ones taking the heaviest hits. Command now faced a dilemma it had never trained for. Break doctrine and risk chaos, or keep following a plan that seemed to be feeding the enemy information. In those opening minutes, it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like duty. And duty kept the fleet moving along tracks the enemy had already mapped. By the time braking pattern became a real consideration, the opportunity had nearly vanished. Too many ships were damaged. Visibility was too poor to maneuver freely. The cost of deviation now felt higher than anyone was willing to accept. So the fleet continued to do everything right. And with each correct maneuver, it sailed deeper into a disaster that had been waiting all along. The first serious damage didn't break the plan. It triggered it. As ships were hit, German command responded exactly as doctrine dictated. Damaged vessels adjusted their position within the formation. Nearby ships compensated to preserve spacing. Speed was carefully regulated to keep the fleet together. The whole formation behaved like a machine responding to stress. And that was the problem. Every correction could be seen coming. Enemy fire wasn't reacting to German intent, it was tracking German inevitability. When a damaged ship slowed, the surrounding ships turned as expected. When the formation tightened to protect cohesion, shells arrived where the density increased. Each adjustment followed a logic the enemy had already mapped out. The battle began to feel compressed. Not because it was chaotic, but because consequences arrived faster than decisions could change them. Orders were given, maneuvers executed cleanly, and then punished almost immediately. The gap between action and impact shrank until they felt like the same moment. Confidence began to erode quietly. Crews didn't panic, they did their jobs, but the belief that correct execution led to safety started to crack. Patterns were noticed before they were fully understood. Ships following procedure most precisely seemed to draw the heaviest fire. Smoke and fog closed in. In theory, this should have favored doctrine. Poor visibility was exactly what rigid formations and predictable movement were designed to handle. Instead, it deepened the trap. With vision gone, there was nothing to challenge the plan. Instruments confirmed that ships were exactly where they were supposed to be, which meant they were exactly where the enemy expected them. Command traffic intensified. Orders began to overlap as the situation worsened. Instructions to hold formation collided with emergency maneuvers. Signals to turn arrived just after turns had already begun. Each order made sense on its own. Together, they created hesitation at the edges, brief pauses as captains waited half a second to confirm intent. Half a second was enough. Radar-guided fire exploited those moments relentlessly. Guns didn't wait for German ships to finish maneuvering. They fired into the space the ships were about to occupy. Shells landed as textbook turns were completed, as if obedience itself were being punished. This was the point where the plan stopped offering protection. It became momentum, moving in the wrong direction. Braking pattern now carried enormous risk. Damaged ships couldn't maneuver freely. Visibility made improvisation dangerous. Collision and friendly fire were real threats. Doctrine had been designed to prevent exactly this kind of breakdown. But doctrine was also why the breakdown was accelerating. Command faced an impossible choice without fully recognizing it as one. Continue following a plan that no longer worked, or abandon it in conditions where chaos could be just as deadly. In those first minutes, the fleet chose continuity. Not out of ignorance, but because abandoning the plan felt like choosing disorder in the middle of gunfire. By the time the danger of predictability became undeniable, too much damage had already been done. Fires, flooding, and power loss limited what many ships could do. Radical deviation was no longer an option. Execution had turned into inertia. And inertia was carrying the fleet deeper into a disaster that precision, anticipation, and perfect preparation had already laid out in advance. There came a moment in the battle when abandoning doctrine was no longer an option. Not because command refused to adapt, but because the fleet no longer had the physical freedom to do so. Fires burned across multiple decks, steering failed on several ships, speeds fluctuated without warning, visibility collapsed into layers of smoke and fog. Improvisation needs room to breathe. By the time German command understood that predictability itself had become the enemy's greatest advantage, that room was gone. Ships that might have broken pattern earlier could no longer maneuver on their own. A sudden turn risked collision. An unexpected change in speed threatened to tear the formation apart under fire. Doctrine, once a choice, had become the only framework still preventing total disorder. That was the trap. The plan could no longer be escaped because it was now the only thing holding the fleet together at all. Even a flawed structure is still structure when everything else is falling apart. Enemy fire took full advantage of that final constraint. Once it was clear the fleet could not deviate in any meaningful way, anticipation became absolute. There was no longer uncertainty about what German ships could or couldn't do next. Guns weren't fired in hope or reaction, they were fired into inevitability. That was when the losses accelerated. Ships already damaged were hit again as they struggled to hold position. Ships still intact were struck as they tried to compensate. No maneuver reduced exposure. Every movement simply decided which ship would be hit next. The plan didn't collapse in a dramatic failure. It closed. And once it closed, the fleet was locked inside it, executing flawlessly, suffering precisely, with no remaining path that didn't lead straight through fire. The ships didn't all meet the same end. Some were lost almost instantly, direct hits to engine rooms or magazines that ended their fight in seconds. They disappeared into smoke and flames so quickly that crews on nearby ships barely had time to understand what had happened. Others lasted longer. Fires crept through compartments. Power failed piece by piece. Steering grew unreliable. These ships stayed afloat long enough for crews to fight desperately to regain control, only to watch it slip away minute by minute. Some losses came indirectly. Damaged ships forced sudden maneuvers by those around them. In fog so thick there was no warning, collisions followed. Hulls already weakened by explosions tore open when steel met steel. What tied all of these losses together was inevitability. Once a ship slipped into the enemy's predicted path, there was no way out. Every evasive option had already been anticipated. Survival depended less on skill or courage than on whether a ship happened to fall outside the next expected correction. By the time the full scale of the disaster became clear, 10 ships were gone. Not scattered in retreat. Not deliberately sacrificed. They were removed by a system that punished doing everything right more reliably than making mistakes. For the men on board, the most unsettling realization didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly. They had followed orders. They had held formation. They had executed every maneuver exactly as they'd been trained to. And it hadn't helped. There was no single mistake to blame, no collapse in discipline, no moment of panic. The crews didn't feel beaten, they felt caught inside a system that no longer responded to effort. That was deeply disturbing. Military training teaches that doing the right thing improves your chances. Here, doing the right thing only confirmed what the enemy already expected. The more precisely doctrine was followed, the more predictable the ships became. Damage control teams worked without pause. Gunnery crews fired whenever they could. Officers passed orders calmly and without hesitation. None of it changed where the battle was headed. The enemy didn't need the Germans to fail. They only needed them to stay consistent. That understanding spread unevenly. Some crews sensed it instinctively, others never quite did. But the result was the same for everyone. The fight became about lasting as long as possible, not about winning. Survival began to feel arbitrary, not earned. It was only after the engagement ended that the full pattern became clear. When the reports were gathered and timelines laid side by side, command finally saw it. Enemy fire had lined up perfectly with doctrinal movement. The salvos didn't chase German ships. They met them. The conclusion was deeply uncomfortable. The fleet hadn't been outfought. It had been read. Every maneuver matched expectation. Every correction narrowed the range of possibilities. Doctrine had given the enemy a forecast more accurate than any reconnaissance ever could. That wasn't an easy lesson to accept. Doctrine is built to be trusted. Questioning it means questioning years of training, experience, and belief. But the North Sea in 1943 revealed something new. Predictability could now be exploited faster than it could be corrected. The understanding came only after it no longer mattered. When the firing finally stopped, the North Sea slipped back into its familiar grey calm. Debris drifted on the surface, oil spread in thin, wavering sheets. The ships that remained moved cautiously, unsure whether danger still lingered. There was no pursuit, just emptiness. What felt most unsettling was how ordinary the sea looked. 10 ships were gone, and the water showed no sign that anything extraordinary had taken place. The battle hadn't ended with a single dramatic moment. It ended when predictability ran out of space to work. This battle wasn't lost because of mistakes. It was lost because everything was done perfectly. The German fleet followed doctrine to the letter. Every maneuver unfolded as expected. Every correction landed exactly where the enemy's calculations said it would. In a war where anticipation had become as powerful as firepower, that kind of predictability was deadly. Doctrine is meant to reduce uncertainty. By 1943, it also stripped away freedom. The fleet didn't sail into disaster by ignoring the plan. It sailed into disaster by trusting it completely. And when the enemy understood the plan just as well as the fleet did, perfection turned into the most dangerous mistake of all.